Thanks a lot, Jay and Mary, and thanks everybody for inviting me here tonight. I am a visual learner, and so I'm a visual teacher. So I'm going to use a slide deck. I hope that's all right. Maybe a little less personal, but um, hopefully maybe it'll add to some clarity here. Let's see. Are people able to see that, and can people hear me okay? Okay, great. All right. Well, tonight I want to talk about how the earth influences creating theology. So I want to step a little bit outside the theology that Jay has presented over the last two sessions, excellent as it is, and think a little bit about how that gets created. And then I want to note some of the impact of the way the West has answered that question. So I want to make sure that you know I'm not an academic. I greatly admire the discipline of the academics, and the things that I'm going to present tonight should probably be rigorously checked by the academics, but they haven't been, and I want to just say that up front. I am a seminary trained priest. I have practiced as a priest, which means I have practiced kind of lived theology with a community for about 12 years. I have a BA in English. I focused in the British Romantic period, which is important because that was the first intellectual response to the Industrial Revolution, which I'll mention tonight. I've traveled a good bit, so I've seen part of the world, mainly the West, and I've lived in the wilderness and on farms. That's important because I've been in a lot of times where I'm not in control and the earth is in control. And so I'll speak a little bit about that in a minute. This is the area in which the theology that Jay has been reminding us about our theology. This is where it grew up. It grew up in the Middle East, on the edge of the Mediterranean, on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. You see a lot of dry area around that, known as desert. When we hear Jesus went out to the wilderness to be tempted, he went to a lonely place, which is in the Greek word, it's a lonely place. It refers to an empty place, a place of wilderness. And the Hebrew people often went to empty places because they were exiled. They were marched off to new places to be slaves, and they got to return to their beloved homeland, their chosen land there in Israel. It's a fairly arid area. It's very rocky. There is vegetation, but it's sparser than what we're used to in Minnesota. There's a big open area of land fissured by canyons, ephemeral streams, ephemeral vegetation that comes and goes. But in the highlands, you do find vegetation. And certainly in the ancient times, in the BC time and in the first century Palestine, it would have been a wetter area than it is today. And it would have had vegetation for livestock. In some places, it would have enough rainfall for small scale agriculture. This is a picture of what modern irrigation can do. So there wouldn't have been modern level irrigation, but there would have been irrigation and small scale farming. I spent about 3 weeks there in 2007, but the reason I think I know a little bit more about what it's like to live there is that I lived for about 6 years in the Big Bend region of Texas, which is in the same basic latitude as Jerusalem, and which has a very similar topography. Here you can see in this map, you can see the Rio Grande coming down here, forming that great big bend that's noticeable. Maybe some of you have been there, and down all the way out to the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know if you can see it, but here's a river that comes into the Rio Grande right here called the Rio Conchos. And I lived in a little farming community not far from there. So similar terrain, rocky, arid vegetation, but sparse vegetation, ephemeral streams, some grazing areas in the highlands, and some agriculture. I didn't have a nice picture of the at grade picture of the alfalfa and cantaloupe fields, but this is an aerial view of the little town that I lived in called Redford. And you can see here the river winding through the valley, and on the US side and on the Mexico side are rudimentary irrigation canals built in the 1800s by hand that still function as irrigation ditches and transfer water to areas that create crops. So, and just to notice, you see, as in Israel, you see large areas that are essentially empty, what we might call empty. And the lived area is around where there's water and life and crops and vegetation. So when we think about theology, the theology, especially the theology of stewardship of the Hebrews that Jay so eloquently exposed for us, we think of this God-earth-human relationship, and it has certain characteristics. And Jay pointed to some really unique places in our scriptures that talk about how we're supposed to live with the land, what the prescriptions are for how we work with it. He talked about the Jubilee year. He talked about some places where there's mention of, not to plow too far to the fence line. Some actual incidences with Naboth and the sharing of land and whatnot. And so we see that there's some prescriptions that God gives about how humans are to live with the earth that come up out of how humans lived with the earth, that they had to make choices. And then out of that little kind of three-way relationship, you have some derivative laws and prescriptions that are more human to human, how humans are to relate to one another. So that's kind of basic construct. And earth is a key leg of the triangle. It's a key point of the three-legged triangle there. We might actually say that it's hard for the earth not to be. On the picture on the left, that's the bigger picture, you can imagine being a fish and swimming through water. You don't even see the water. It's just what you live in, right? And much of our theology, perhaps all of our theology in our scriptures, was developed in a situation in which people didn't notice the water in which they were creating their theology. They just saw it. The theology just rose from the milieu that they were in. You and I today, we're a little bit more like people that can look at the fish in the bowl and see that the fish is seeing through a medium that can temper and filter how the fish understands God, so to speak. So in a more accurate diagram might look like this. Humans are within the earth and they can't get to God except through the earth. So we only know God through the constructs of the earth in which we live, or at least in the times in which our Christian theology, our Hebrew theology was developed, that was the nature of what it meant to be human. And in fact, we see God breaking into human existence through the earth. Oftentimes in our theology, God uses earthly things to mitigate divine instruction. So for instance, God appears to Moses in the burning bush. God evidences the liberation of the Jews through plagues, which are all based in earth constructs. Those plagues have to do with the earth. Elijah hears God in the still small voice of the wind. There are times where God has a more, what we would call a theophany, where God kind of directly speaks to somebody, such as Samuel was a good example. But in general, people in the theology in which we're steeped that we lean on, they saw God through the earth and they received God through the earth. In fact, much of the Jewish cosmology and the prophets has to do with some antecedent fertility understandings of appeasing God, or at least God being happy when the earth is blessing human beings. When there's enough water, when there's enough food, that's an evidence that God is with people. When there's drought, when there's strictness, when the people are ripped away from their land, that's an evidence that God is upset or that people are out of relationship with God. So the point here that I'm making is that it was very difficult in the theology that we've received from the Christian and Hebrew sources to think of God in any other way than through the earth and receiving God from the earth. Now, consider what it's like to be in a different environment. This is a forest in the British Isles. This would be, some of us have ancestors that would have come from this locality. And think about the difference in how you would think about God and what theology might arise from this kind of environment and this kind of earth. This is a forest in Ireland. This is a forest actually in British Columbia, but I use it as an example to remind us that the kind of old growth that was present in the British Isles and in much of Northern Europe, Western Europe, would have been monstrous. It would have been huge. It would have been it would not have been at all that experience of the emptiness into which humanity exerts its will. It would have been human beings showing up in a garden that's already formed, that's already existing, and then kind of picking and plucking the fruits from that garden that already exists. There would have been places that there would have been open spaces. This is a picture of remnants of Hadrian's Wall. So this would have reminded us that the Romans did bring their theology and their way of thinking to this same area. This would be the furthest north that they got. But even before Hadrian's Wall, there would have been areas of openness for livestock and some small scale agriculture. So a good way to understand theology and think about this resident theology would be to look at Augustine and Pelagius. Augustine, the famous saint, Augustine of Hippo from northern Africa, from whom we get the beautiful Confessions and much of the grounding of Roman Christianity. Augustine grew up in that more dry, arid area that would be more like the Mediterranean and Israel and northern Africa. And he came up he came to Christianity from a cosmology and a theology that was very dualistic. It was good and evil, black and white. And he brought some of that to Christianity, and he saw Christianity as he's the father of the doctrine of original sin. He's not the only one that created that, but he kind of refined it in a way that set it on its course to instruct us for centuries to come. And you can imagine that if you grew up in an earth in which you had to exert your will to kind of make a life and make a living, that that original sin might be more compelling as a doctrine or a way of understanding God. Pelagius so this is kind of a picture of, remember, this is kind of the landscape that Augustine would have been in. Pelagius would have grown up in a different landscape in the British Isles or Northern Europe, where there's this kind of robust forest that already exists, from which humanity makes its way by, killing small game or larger game and finding nuts and berries and gleaning what's already there before. And so, not surprising, Pelagius is known for this theology of, some people have called it original goodness. That's not exactly the right term, but it's essentially that humanity is fallen, that humanity started good, and then, it has drifted away from the best of what God has called human beings to be. So it's a slightly different emphasis. And Augustine and Pelagius are notorious for having disagreed in the 4th century and, had some big fights there. Augustine eventually prevailed with the Roman way. And many of us know about the Celtic way, which would be a little bit more aligned with Pelagius. And I want to be careful not to overstate Celtic Christianity here, but because to some extent, our own responses in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s have been to recover what we would like to give Celtic Christianity, which is not exactly what Celtic Christianity was. But on broad sketch terms, we can say that Celtic Christianity came out of a different environment, and it arrived at different conclusions about who God was, and it emphasized different things about God's goodness and God's relationship with humanity. So again, remember, this would be, for most of human history, this is the experience that most humans have in understanding who God is. We can only go through the earth to get to God. But what happens when human beings start to rise above the earth? When our systems, our technologies, our political structures, our civilizations start to get more and more and more complex, and we begin to be able to live an existence that's not as tied to earthly requirements. We kind of become we slowly become able to escape the earth in a way. And of course, the richer we are in whatever society we might envision, the higher and farther away from the earth we can rise. And it's the poor in the societies that tend to live closest to the earth. So in this kind of case, human beings begin to be able to posit who God is and what theology is directly from a human point of view, and not as often mitigated through the constraints and the opportunities that the earth gives us. As that becomes more sophisticated and more complex, human beings begin to swirl around in their own political structures. And the way we begin to understand God has a lot more to do with how humans relate to one another rather than how humans relate to the earth or how humans relate to God. And we begin to project our own humanity and our own political structures onto God and onto who God is. And that third point of the triangle, the earth, gets kind of disassociated, and we can emphasize that less. Ultimately, what happens when that occurs is that we begin to see the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, 1600s, 1700s. And we began to colonize the New World with this kind of theology. It's a power over the earth, and it's a power over one another. And the political structures that begin to exist become more dominant and more important than the structures between humanity and the earth. So we bring with us a whole variety of theologies, from Roman Catholic to Lutheran, Anglican, Methodist, a version of Anglicanism, Jewish, Quaker, Anabaptist, Moravian, Muslim. We bring slaves from largely Africa, which bring their own multi-indigenous theologies. But all of this is kind of overridden by this dominant concept that's given to humanity through the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And that in the 1600s and 1700s focuses in kind of the nation state and the colonial structures, power over. So in the Industrial Revolution, we see the steam and coal mechanisms come into place. We see the Bessemer process discover the ability to make better steel, in which we can start building much more sophisticated structures for our politics, our government, our economic structures, our cities. The Haber-Bosch process allows us to fix nitrogen in the late 1800s, which allows us to divorce ourselves from the requirements of basic plant life. So instead of growing plants the way we always have, we're able to fix nitrogen and grow them according to our own human needs, which is to make things more simple. And we just add nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then we don't have to think about all the other processes that have been required. It's interesting that the Haber-Bosch process simultaneously contributed to the ability to create bombs, which led to the kind of destruction that we saw in World War I. Cities become more complex. Urban life begins to define our cities are still small relative to today, but cities become more and more the norm, and they start setting the norms of fashion and intellect and understanding about what's important. The most wealthy show up, they live in cities. The folks with the most education live in cities. And so that begins to drive how we think about life and theology. In response to this, somewhat in reaction and somewhat in line with, we start to see an intellectual response to this that comes out of the British Romantics, also the European Romantics. And we get far enough, essentially, we get far enough away from nature that we can begin to love it on its own terms. We begin to see beauty in nature that as a human species we didn't see before. And it's partly because we can get up above the earth and have a different experience of the earth that we're able to see beauty in the earth that wasn't there before. And so we have all these British romantics that start to see the city as a place of unsacred space and nature as a place of sacred space. And Wordsworth talks about the world being too much with us. He talks about how often amidst the din of cities have I turned back to you, O sylvan Wye, this kind of virgin forest that brings him beauty and sustenance. Gerard Manley Hopkins talks about God's grandeur in the natural world and how all in the city is seared with trade and speared with man's toil and shares man's smudge and smell. Shelley, the great poet, talks about, what would earth and sky and sea be if to the human mind's imagining science and solitude were vacancy? If being by yourself and thinking with God was just an absence, then earth and sky and sea wouldn't seem so beautiful, but actually they do seem beautiful. So there must be something resident in there that's sacred. Coleridge with his lime tree bower, Turner and Constable as illustrators began to create these. Artists start painting landscapes of nature and seeing the beauty in nature, and that's brought forth in the Royal Academy. People who are wealthy enough actually start traveling to the countryside to visit these beautiful landscapes. And the Royal Academy in Britain actually comes up with this concept of beauty that people want to emulate. And they start painting these little postcards wherever they go that mimic this new understanding of beauty. Perhaps the only person that really questions this new concept of beauty is Mary Shelley. And she's the one that wrote Frankenstein that, of course, questions whether the people's creation of this new science and new understanding, whether that's actually good or whether it kind of creates a bit of a monster that runs away. So as many of you know, we go on through the Industrial Revolution into the Americas. The oil and the automobile become central. We develop modern concrete and asphalt and paved roads all over the place. We develop the atomic bomb, rocketry. We land on the moon, which is kind of the epitome of getting off the earth in a way that we can look back. And what kind of theology comes out of the moon, or the ability to see the earth? We begin to genetic sequence. We have the green revolution, in which we can grow much more food because of how we manipulate plants. Ultimately, we modify genes and we develop a supercomputer. And corresponding to that, we have this long list of intellectuals within the American experience that react to that. From Ralph Waldo Emerson to John Muir to Rachel Carson, even our own Walter Mondale, who helped create the wild and scenic rivers, and we know Al Gore and Bill McKibben as response to climate crisis. So I'm closing down here. I'm getting the last few slides, and then we'll go to some questions here. But I just want to remind you that the ultimate fruit of this industrial revolution and this kind of theology that came out of humans rising above the earth is this concept, is this fact of science that have shown that we have too much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And it bears just saying again, even though you've probably seen this, it's become kind of cliche to call this the hockey stick graph. It traces the amount of carbon dioxide that's been in the atmosphere for 800,000 years. Scientists have been able to get this by drilling ice cores in Antarctica that measure atmospheric carbon as far back as 800,000 years. And you can see that that level of carbon dioxide has not risen above 300 for all 800,000 years of the last 800,000 years of the Earth until 1950, in which it jumped 30% to 400 parts per million. So to put this in perspective, it just is important to say that, if 100,000 years equals a mile, you would be walking about from St. Mark's to, say, St. John the Evangelist, if some of you have been over to St. John the Evangelist and St. Paul. And if you can picture walking that far, 8 miles, everything would be normal and static, under 300 parts per million, until you got about 3.5 feet from St. John's. So in the last 3.5 feet, suddenly you would jump 30%. And to put this in perspective, you can imagine that if you say we're in the last year of your mortgage for your house and you suddenly had to pay 30% more than you had expected to, that would be pretty jarring. That would really shake you up a little bit. Or, let's say you went out for the day and suddenly the temperature jumped 30% in the span of about 10 minutes. That would really change what kind of clothing you needed to have on to be comfortable. Those are examples of how much of a change this is and how short of a time in the Earth's life cycle. So we know that the consequences from this have rippled out. We have drought, we have more intense hurricanes, we have ocean acidification, all the different things on this page, and then some correlative consequences like climate refugees, cities facing too high, water inundating them and flooding, all kinds of insurance problems and economic problems that are erupting because of this. So the question I want to invite you to is to think about, how different our lives are as human beings from most of human history in how we can conceive of theology and how we can conceive of our place in the world. Again, remember that until, at the very soonest, the 1600s, most people couldn't conceive of God except through the earth and through the most basic human relationships of like a child with a parent or a spouse with a spouse. But now we're in a brave new world. We're in a very different place. And so Mary's going to put the questions in the chat here, and I would invite you to share with one another in your breakout sessions, where have you experienced really having a resident indigenous theology in the earth? Where have you really experienced God in the earth? And then where is a place in your life, and there might be many, but think of one, where you're kind of living above the earth. You're living above the earth, and what might that say about what you think about God and your relationship with God?
Thanks, Buff. A lot of food for thought there, and you've got the questions in the chat. And Mary, are you going to send us on our way?
I am. I'm having a little trouble on my screen. So I'm going to push a button and I hope it's the right one, but I can't tell whether it is or not. So we have the meeting room set for 20 minutes and there's about 4 or 5 of you in each room. So, all right. See you soon. Thank you. Good. So Lisa, are you going to join a group?